School security. We have a disturbance in the main hallway. Principal Diana Wilkins' voice echoed through Westridge Academy's polished corridor as Zoe Robinson calmly adjusted her backpack strap. Young lady, you clearly don't belong in this section. The Gucci-clad students froze mid-conversation. Cell phones discreetly rose to record. Zoe, in simple jeans and a plain hoodie, remained perfectly composed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The same backpack containing a speech that would change everything in exactly 7 minutes. This is the honors wing, Diana continued, her manicured finger pointing accusingly. The regular classes are in the East Building. Her voice dripped with the kind of condescension that transformed ordinary school moments into viral sensations. The security guard's hand hovered over his radio, awaiting orders. But Zoe simply checked her watch. 2:47 p.m. She had 13 minutes before her scheduled meeting with the school board. What Principal Wilkins didn't know would transform this moment from another routine discrimination incident into one of the most shocking stories in Westridge Academy's history. A real-life story that would reshape an entire educational system. Have you ever held the power to destroy someone's career while they treated you like trash? The discrimination began with Diana Wilkins' practiced scan, eyes moving deliberately from Zoe's worn sneakers to her simple hoodie. Zoe recognized the look instantly. 4 years navigating predominantly white educational spaces had taught her to read these micro-expressions, the subtle tightening around the eyes that preceded professional humiliation. Her mother, the governor, used to call it the look that could steal your dignity if you let it. As the first black female governor in the state's history, she'd encountered it countless times during her rise through politics. "I'm going to need to see your hall pass and student ID," Diana announced, her voice carrying across the hallway like a courtroom verdict. Zoe almost smiled, remembering her first day as a freshman at this very school 3 years ago, when a different administrator had used nearly identical words. Back then, she'd fumbled nervously through her backpack. Today, she simply observed the performance with clinical detachment. A blonde girl in designer clothes glided past the security checkpoint without breaking stride. Diana's face transformed instantly, the suspicious frown melting into a warm smile as she waved her through to the honors classroom. No hall pass requested, no ID required. Zoe had witnessed this same theatrical double standard countless times during her high school career, but seeing it directed at herself again felt like studying racism under a microscope. The Apple Watch on her wrist read 2:49 p.m. 11 minutes until the emergency school board meeting that would reshape this academy forever. Behind the security desk, a young teacher named Marcus Jackson activated his phone camera with practiced stealth. Zoe had read his discrimination complaint last month, a brilliant black female educator documenting bias patterns that perfectly aligned with what the state investigation had uncovered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This is an advanced placement wing," Diana continued, each word dripping with territorial authority. "Perhaps you're looking for the remedial classrooms." The suggestion carried the weight of institutional racism that Zoe had spent her high school years navigating. Her mother's policy research had explored exactly this phenomenon, how educational institutions used geography and tracking to maintain segregated service levels. Diana was providing a textbook example of discriminatory gatekeeping. As Zoe reached into her backpack, Diana caught a glimpse of cream-colored cardstock protruding from the front pocket. Not ordinary notebook paper, but the distinctive heavy stationery of the governor's office. Official seal instead of school logo. Her brain processed fragments. Black teenage girl, expensive watch, governor's stationery. Connections that should have triggered immediate protocols recognition. But cognitive bias creates selective blindness, and Diana's assumptions overpowered obvious evidence. Zoe placed her student ID on the counter, watching Diana examine it with theatrical suspicion. She began typing meaninglessly on a computer terminal, a performance Zoe had witnessed during previous discriminatory encounters. "These days, we can't be too careful about unauthorized visitors," she declared, though Zoe's credentials clearly warranted immediate passage according to the school's own protocols. The phone calls began at 2:52 p.m. "Governor's office" flashed on Zoe's screen. She declined without hesitation, remembering her mother's advice from years ago. "Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let people reveal themselves completely before you reveal yourself." Diana noticed the call, but interpreted it through her bias filter. Troublemakers often had parents who tried to intimidate school officials with important-sounding contacts. When State Education Board called seconds later, she felt vindicated in her troublemaker theory. "Miss Robinson," she said, drawing out Zoe's surname like evidence in a discrimination case. "I'll need documentation of your enrollment in AP courses before we can proceed. Class schedules, teacher recommendations, proof of qualifying test scores." Zoe recognized the tactic immediately, creating bureaucratic barriers that existed nowhere in Westridge Academy policy. During her mother's tenure reforming educational protocols, she'd specifically prohibited this kind of arbitrary documentation requirement for students accessing academic resources. Officer Thompson, the security guard, shifted uncomfortably as the interaction stretched beyond normal parameters. His training manual covered standard scenarios: legitimate students processed quickly, problem individuals either departed or escalated to disciplinary intervention. This felt different. Zoe's unnatural calm suggested someone accustomed to power dynamics, not intimidated by authority. The marble-floored hallway amplified every tension-filled sound, while other students maintained their pretense of distraction. "I appreciate your thoroughness," Zoe replied, her tone carrying professional familiarity that made Officer Thompson unconsciously step backward. "Educational excellence is crucial in college preparatory environments. I'm sure the superintendent would be proud of your attention to detail." The comment landed with subtle menace. Zoe spoke about educational hierarchies with insider knowledge, discussing administrative structures like someone who understood them intimately. Diana's pride overrode her growing unease. She'd committed to this performance, and backing down would feel like admitting error. By 2:54 p.m., Marcus's livestream had reached 13,000 viewers as people shared similar discrimination experiences in real-time comments. The digital audience was witnessing institutional racism unfold in Westridge Academy's flagship location, creating viral documentation of systemic bias. Zoe reflected on the irony. Her mother had spent 6 months investigating discriminatory practices at this exact school, analyzing complaint patterns that painted Diana Wilkins as a repeat offender. The state audit had uncovered systematic tracking of minority students away from advanced courses, but Diana remained oblivious to the investigation swirling around her. She was about to provide the final evidence needed for comprehensive reform. "Young lady, I'm going to have to ask you to wait in the main office while we complete our verification process. This could take some time." Another phone buzzed showed Governor's Chief of Staff. Urgent. Zoe declined without hesitation, remembering her mother's advice from years ago. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people reveal themselves completely before you reveal yourself. "Miss Wilkins?" Zoe said quietly, her voice carrying years of watching her mother navigate political battles. "I understand you're following what you believe to be protocol, but protocols in education can change very quickly, especially when they violate state anti-discrimination laws." Diana's face flushed, but retreat was impossible now. The performance had to continue until its inevitable conclusion. Zoe checked her watch. 2:55 p.m. 23 minutes of documented discrimination. 5 minutes until everything changed. The countdown had begun, and Diana Wilkins was about to star in the most dramatic educational reckoning in state history. At 2:56 p.m., Vice Principal Robert Caldwell emerged from the administrative corridor with the urgency of someone whose professional evaluation depended on crisis management. His tailored suit couldn't disguise the panic Diana's frantic text had triggered. Unauthorized visitor, situation escalating, need immediate assistance. Zoe recognized the type instantly from her time accompanying her mother to educational conferences. Ambitious middle management, terrified of any situation that might reflect poorly on their leadership capabilities. "What's the situation?" Robert demanded, his voice carrying authority borrowed from hierarchy rather than earned through wisdom. Zoe had encountered dozens of Robert Caldwells during her young life, navigating educational spaces as the governor's daughter, administrators who confused positional power with actual competence, who solved problems through intimidation because investigation required skills they'd never developed. Her own mother, Governor Elise Robinson, had warned her about this exact personality type. They're dangerous because they'd rather be decisively wrong than appear indecisive. Diana's relief was palpable as she gestured toward Zoe. Potential unauthorized visitor, refusing proper documentation, declining suspicious phone calls that appeared to be attempts at intimidation. Her confidence had rebuilt itself around Robert's presence, the way institutional bias gains strength through collective reinforcement. Zoe remembered reading about this psychological phenomenon during her AP psychology research, how individual prejudice multiplies when validated by authority figures. "Young lady, I'm Robert Caldwell, Vice Principal of Westridge Academy," he announced, positioning himself between Zoe and the classroom hallway like a territorial guardian. The body language was textbook administrative dominance, exactly the kind of posturing Zoe had observed during her mother's meetings with resistant school boards. Back then, she'd been nervous and intimidated. Today, she simply observed the performance with clinical detachment. "No difficulty at all," she replied evenly. "I've provided valid student identification that your staff is choosing to question." The emphasis on choosing carried weight that made Robert's jaw tighten. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected from an intimidated student. During her mother's investigation of this school, Zoe had reviewed hours of testimony showing exactly this escalation pattern with other minority students. Marcus's camera angle captured everything perfectly, his live stream exploding to 25,000 viewers as social media algorithms amplified the content. "I'm going to need you to surrender your backpack for inspection," Robert declared, his voice echoing across the marble designed to amplify authority. The request violated every Westridge Academy protocol Zoe's mother had helped establish during her education reform initiative. Students weren't subjected to searches reserved for suspected criminals. But Robert was improvising theater designed to force voluntary departure through public humiliation. Zoe checked her Apple Watch. 2:57 p.m. 3 minutes until the emergency board meeting her mother had called specifically to address this school's discrimination patterns. The irony was perfect. She'd arrived early to meet her mother and present student testimonials, and Robert Caldwell was providing the final proof needed to accelerate state intervention. Her mother's investigation had documented similar treatment affecting hundreds of minority students, but nothing compared to experiencing it personally. Officer Thompson positioned himself at Zoe's left shoulder, while a second security guard materialized from the corridor. The physical intimidation followed a predictable script Zoe had witnessed countless times during her mother's investigation. Surround the target, create public spectacle, force compliance through embarrassment. Robert's strategy relied on most students' natural conflict avoidance, but he was fundamentally misunderstanding his opponent's psychology and position. "I understand your security concerns," Zoe replied, her tone carrying undertones that made both guards unconsciously retreat. But forced searches without probable cause create significant liability for educational institutions. Her casual reference to education regulations wasn't lost on Robert, who recognized the vocabulary of someone familiar with school law. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Zoe spoke like an education policy expert while maintaining complete immunity to authority-based intimidation. Robert's certainty began wavering as he processed the disconnect between Diana's troublemaker theory and Zoe's confident responses. During his own climb through educational administration, he'd learned to read power dynamics instinctively, and everything about Zoe suggested someone accustomed to authority rather than intimidated by it. But admitting error now would mean acknowledging participation in potential discrimination against a legitimate student. At 2:58 p.m., Governor Robinson, direct line, flashed on Zoe's screen. She declined while maintaining eye contact with Robert, whose confusion deepened with each refused connection. Zoe remembered her first time accompanying her mother to a policy meeting 2 years ago, the nervous energy of trying to prove herself worthy of being there. Today felt different. She wasn't seeking validation, but delivering judgment on an institution that had failed its own standards. "You're disrupting other students' educational experience," Robert announced, gesturing toward onlookers whose phones discreetly captured every moment. The accusation was precisely backwards. Disruption stemmed entirely from administration's discriminatory treatment, not Zoe's presence. But shifting blame was a survival skill Robert had perfected during his climb through educational hierarchy. The same skill set Zoe had observed administrators use against students who challenged systemic bias. Marcus's footage had become a viral phenomenon, with viewers sharing across platforms faster than any educational scandal in recent memory. Comments evolved into real-time forums where students documented similar discrimination experiences, creating evidence of systemic educational bias that would soon reach state investigators. Local news outlets were picking up the story as social media algorithms amplified content to hundreds of thousands of viewers. "I think we need to call the police," Diana whispered, loud enough for Zoe to hear. The threat was designed to force capitulation. Most students would rather leave than face potential arrest in public. But Zoe simply adjusted her backpack and checked her watch. 2:59 p.m. She'd spent months helping her mother prepare for this exact moment, knowing that real change required undeniable documentation of institutional failure. Robert recognized the point of no return approaching. Either Zoe was an elaborate troublemaker deserving discipline, or they were committing catastrophic error that would destroy their careers. His experience suggested that backing down showed weakness, while instincts whispered warnings about Zoe's supernatural confidence in this situation. The vice principal had built his reputation on decisive action, but decisiveness without wisdom often leads to spectacular failure. "Young lady, I'm giving you one final opportunity to leave this wing voluntarily," Robert declared, his voice carrying across the hallway like judicial sentence. "Otherwise, we'll have you removed for disrupting the educational environment." The ultimatum was delivered with theatrical authority, designed to end confrontation through intimidation rather than investigation. Exactly the kind of lazy leadership Zoe had learned to recognize during her time observing educational politics with her mother. Zoe reached into her backpack slowly, deliberately, while every eye focused on her movements. Phones rose as students prepared to document whatever emerged. Robert and Officer Thompson tensed, hands moving toward communication devices. Diana stepped backward, suddenly uncertain about pushing this confrontation to its logical conclusion. The atmosphere had shifted from routine discrimination to something approaching revelation. "I think," Zoe said quietly, her voice carrying finality that made the marble hallway fall silent, "it's time I made that phone call." Her tone suggested everything previous had been preliminary, data gathering about to transition into judgment. At exactly 3 p.m., Zoe Robinson reached for her phone one final time, and the countdown to educational reckoning reached 0. Zoe Robinson's finger hovered over her phone for exactly 3 seconds. the same pause her mother had taught her before making life-changing decisions. Count to 3, sweetheart. Let them show you who they really are before you show them who you are. The contact name was visible to anyone close enough. Mom, Governor Direct Line. Not troublemaker, but the daughter of the highest executive authority in the state. "Yes, this is Zoe," she said, her voice cutting through hallway silence with surgical precision. "I'm currently at Westridge Academy, and I think we need our education reform meeting moved to 3:45. We have a significant discrimination situation requiring immediate documentation." Each word detonated Diana and Robert's troublemaker theory like controlled demolition. 23 minutes of discrimination crumbling into professional disaster. Diana's transformation was captured perfectly by Marcus's camera. Confusion melting into horrified recognition as her brain finally processed information it had rejected. She'd seen Governor Elise Robinson hundreds of times on television, at public events, in school communications, but cognitive bias had built walls between the casually dressed black teenager and the prominent political figure she'd never bothered to connect. Her mind had compartmentalized the governor's family as invisible theoretical figures rather than real people who might walk through her school. Robert's hands shook as he typed Zoe Robinson, governor's daughter, into Google, each search result landing like physical blows. Robinson's daughter accepted to Harvard. Governor attends daughter's science competition. Zoe Robinson named National Merit Scholar. Robert watched his career prospects dissolve in real time. Zoe watched Robert's face cycle through disbelief, recognition, and dawning horror as reality reconstructed itself around their catastrophic error. A lesson in assumption that perfectly aligned with her mother's warnings about institutional bias. Furthermore, Zoe continued into her phone, legal needs to review today's security footage from multiple angles. We're examining potential civil rights violations requiring immediate remediation during our ongoing educational equity investigation. The irony was perfect. They'd discriminated against the daughter of the executive investigating their discrimination. Zoe remembered her mother's warning from countless dinner conversations. Sometimes the universe provides poetic justice so perfect it feels scripted. The hallway atmosphere had shifted from routine bias to administrative catastrophe. Privileged students realized they were documenting history, not just discrimination, but the moment the governor's daughter experienced the very treatment her mother's investigation was designed to address. Zoe had spent 6 months helping collect student testimonials across the district, but experiencing it personally added emotional weight that no data could capture. Officer Thompson recognized Zoe first. His training including executive protection protocols he'd studied but never expected to use. The calm confidence that seemed suspicious now revealed itself as natural political bearing. Zoe had developed that presence during years accompanying her mother to official functions, learning to project authority even when facing institutional hostility. Officer Thompson's hand moved from his radio like it had become radioactive. "Miss Robinson, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he whispered, his voice carrying defeat. The understatement bordered on comedy, but his attempt at damage control revealed institutional survival mathematics. How quickly staff loyalty shifts when hierarchy reveals itself. Zoe had witnessed this dynamic countless times during official visits, watching school employees recalculate their positions when real power entered the room. Zoe held up one finger while continuing her call, a gesture that would have seemed arrogant from a troublemaker, but now carried legitimate authority. Yes, full incident report for state review, Diana Wilkins, principal, Robert Caldwell, vice principal, complete timeline with witness statements and social media impact analysis. She'd learned this documentation protocol during her mother's first discrimination lawsuit as district attorney. Create comprehensive records before emotions cool and memories fade. Robert's Google search had progressed to images. Zoe at last year's State Education Summit, shaking hands with the Secretary of Education. The same Zoe Robinson who'd stood 3 feet away while Robert threatened her with removal. The vice principal's career flashed before his eyes as he processed the magnitude of his misjudgment. Zoe remembered feeling similar devastation when her own early academic mistakes nearly cost her everything. The difference was learning from failure rather than repeating it. "Miss Robinson," Robert's voice cracked, "I think there's been confusion." Each syllable fought against recognition that no administrative spin could minimize what had occurred. He'd publicly humiliated the governor's daughter while it was live-streamed to tens of thousands. Zoe had been in similar positions once, making assumptions that revealed more about her own biases than the situation she was navigating. Her mother had taught her to recognize these moments as opportunities for growth rather than destruction. Zoe ended her call and turned full attention to Robert. The dynamic shift was palpable. No longer security versus suspect, but daughter of the governor conducting performance review that would determine Robert's future. "Confusion suggests accident," Zoe replied evenly. "What I witnessed was systematic discrimination based on racial profiling." The clinical tone came from years watching her mother handle educational crises, learning to separate emotion from evidence when building cases for institutional change. Diana backed against the marble counter, her professional self-image crumbling. 5 years managing this school, pride in maintaining educational standards. But her screening process had revealed itself as a bias filter, seeing suspicious behavior in legitimate students based on appearance. Zoe's mother had documented identical patterns across the educational system. Well-intentioned professionals whose unconscious prejudices created systematic discrimination they refused to acknowledge. "I need to understand your protocols," Zoe continued, with audit-like detachment. "When did valid student identification become insufficient? When did access to advanced placement wings require additional documentation?" Her questions weren't seeking information, but building legal records for state investigators. During her mother's discrimination cases, she'd learned that documentation was everything. Without proof, bias became he said, she said disputes that institutions always won. Marcus's live stream had exploded into mainstream news. Local stations were preparing segments about Westridge Academy discrimination. Reporters scrambling to understand how the governor's daughter could be humiliated at her own school. Zoe had dreaded this kind of publicity during her mother's investigation, preferring institutional change to personal attention. But sometimes, justice required uncomfortable spotlights. "Those phone calls you dismissed as fake," Zoe said, checking her watch, "were from my mother and her chief of staff. They were confirming my arrival for today's emergency session about discrimination patterns at this school. You've provided the final evidence for state intervention." The revelation was devastating. Their discrimination occurred during active investigation of discriminatory practices. Robert's mind raced through damage control scenarios, but every option led to professional disaster. Acknowledging error meant admitting discrimination against the governor's family. Maintaining the troublemaker theory required ignoring overwhelming evidence. Zoe had watched dozens of administrators face similar reckonings during her mother's investigation. The moment when institutional protection evaporated and personal accountability became unavoidable. "I had no idea who you were," Diana whispered, barely audible. The statement was simultaneously true and damning. True because she'd never bothered to learn what the governor's daughter looked like. Damning because it revealed assumptions underlying her student management. Zoe had heard identical protests across dozens of schools. The "I didn't know" defense was standard among caught discriminators, as if ignorance absolved responsibility for actions. During her AP psychology research on educational discrimination, Zoe had studied this exact pattern, how bias creates selective blindness that allows prejudice to flourish in supposedly equal institutions. Diana's ignorance wasn't accidental, but systematic product of organizational culture making diversity invisible to administrators who claimed commitment to equality while practicing exclusion.
"Your lack of recognition isn't the issue," Zoe replied with devastating precision. "The issue is how you treated someone you didn't recognize. Your protocols for unknown students revealed discriminatory assumptions violating state law and school policy." Her analysis cut through excuses to expose systematic bias. 4 years of watching her mother navigate educational politics had taught her that real change required confronting uncomfortable truths directly. The marble hallway had become an impromptu courtroom where institutional discrimination faced trial in real time. Students, staff, security formed involuntary jury witnessing educational bias exposed surgically. Zoe had transformed from victim to prosecutor, using position to demand accountability most discrimination targets never could. Her mother's words echoed, "Sometimes you have to use your privileges to protect those who don't have any." At 3:02 p.m., Governor Elise Robinson texted, "Watching live stream. Board meeting moved to 4, legal standing by." The message confirmed state leadership was monitoring in real time, treating this as educational crisis requiring immediate intervention. Diana and Robert were no longer managing student discipline, but performing for ultimate bosses who would determine their futures. "I believe," Zoe said quietly, her voice carrying judicial finality that silenced the hallway, "it's time we discussed consequences of what occurred here today." The word consequences hung like sentence, promising ramifications extending far beyond Westridge Academy. Diana and Robert were about to discover that some discrimination targets possess power to ensure accountability, and some educational reckonings broadcast live to the world. Zoe thought of her mother's advice one more time. "Sweetheart, when you have power, use it to protect people who don't." Today, she would do exactly that. The conference room felt like a war tribunal at 3:45 p.m. Zoe had attended dozens of meetings in this glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the school grounds, but entering as both investigator and victim created psychological vertigo that even her AP psychology studies hadn't prepared her for. The same leather chair where she discussed academic competitions would now witness her demanding justice for her own discrimination. Governor Elise Robinson materialized on the wall-mounted monitor from the Capitol, her expression carrying controlled fury Zoe recognized from their worst family crises. "I watched the entire live stream," Elise began without preamble. 250,000 views and climbing. Our educational reform agenda is gaining undeniable evidence in real time." Her voice carried the weight of someone calculating justice while planning institutional surgery. Zoe remembered her mother's first campaign speech 5 years ago, when she'd personally promised that their state would lead the nation in educational equity, a promise now being tested by viral discrimination footage. Sarah Martinez entered with the purposeful stride of someone who'd been preparing for this exact crisis. As State Attorney General, she'd helped Governor Robinson navigate educational reform battles when she was a junior legislator and Zoe was a middle school student fighting for academic recognition. "The timing couldn't be worse," she said, spreading documents across the polished table that gleamed like administrative altar. Civil rights investigators were already scheduled to review this school next week for pattern discrimination. Today's incident transforms their inquiry from routine audit to federal case study. Superintendent James Wilson sat across from Zoe, his face reflecting the panic of watching subordinates commit career suicide on camera. "I've reviewed security footage from every conceivable angle," he reported with his voice tight with controlled anxiety. "What Diana and Robert did was textbook racial profiling captured in high definition with multiple witness corroboration." Wilson had risen through educational administration alongside Governor Robinson, and both understood that institutional survival required swift action when civil rights violations occurred in public view. Zoe opened her mother's old leather portfolio, the same one she'd carried since law school, now containing student testimonials that would reshape state education. "The reputational damage has already begun," she said, her voice carrying the confidence her mother had instilled in her. "Public trust damage from today alone is projected to significantly impact enrollment based on response patterns from similar discrimination scandals." The numbers weren't theoretical.
Zoe had studied Parkland Academy's discrimination crisis, watched Central High School lose accreditation for bias patterns, seen how educational scandals destroyed institutional reputations faster than budget cuts. Legal exposure extends far beyond today, Sarah continued, her presentation revealing systematic institutional failure Governor Robinson's investigation had uncovered. We've documented patterns suggesting widespread bias affecting hundreds of minority students over 18 months. Federal investigators are no longer coming to audit, they're coming to prosecute. Her words landed like depth charges in the silent conference room, each syllable representing accountability most discrimination victims never achieve. Governor Robinson's voice cut through the video connection with executive-level decisiveness. Social media responses generated unprecedented public support for our educational equity legislation. Community leaders are calling state representatives, demanding comprehensive reform rather than isolated discipline. Zoe had predicted this public response during their investigation planning. Educational stakeholders increasingly viewed discrimination as institutional risk rather than isolated incident. Superintendent Wilson pulled up real-time data, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through parent communications. Dozens of families have expressed concern in the past 2 hours. Our enrollment projections are showing significant vulnerability. And the mathematics of discrimination were becoming brutally clear. Bias wasn't just morally bankrupt, it was institutionally catastrophic when exposed to sunlight. Zoe leaned forward, channeling the calm authority she'd developed watching her mother navigate political crises. I'm proposing complete institutional overhaul, not individual punishment. First, immediate reassignment of Diana Wilkins and Robert Caldwell with mandatory retraining before any future administrative positions. Her recommendation wasn't driven by revenge, but institutional necessity. Keeping discriminatory administrators in leadership positions sent messages that bias carried no meaningful consequences. Second, Zoe continued, referencing investigation notes that had consumed 6 months of her after-school hours. Mandatory bias recognition training for every faculty member, with quarterly renewals and performance evaluation integration. She'd studied successful culture transformations at schools that had survived discrimination scandals. Theoretical diversity training was worthless without practical skills for recognizing and countering personal prejudices. Sarah calculated legal implications while taking rapid notes. Third element addresses monitoring technology. Implementing objective criteria for advanced placement access, eliminating subjective gatekeeper models that enable discriminatory tracking. Zoe had researched this approach extensively during her work with her mother, knowing that human bias was too subtle and systematic for manual oversight to detect consistently. Implementation speed is critical, Governor Robinson interjected from the Capitol, her executive experience recognizing that delayed response would be interpreted as institutional indifference. Federal investigators evaluate our response timeline as evidence of cultural commitment versus damage control. Her analysis reflected leadership understanding that discrimination scandals required complete cultural surgery rather than individual band-aids. Zoe opened her portfolio's final section, revealing the proposal that would transform crisis into educational leadership. Establishing a $2 million fund for educational equity programs in underserved communities administered through partnership with established civil rights organizations. The recommendation addressed systematic exclusion that created educational discrimination's foundation. Equal opportunity would make bias economically unsustainable. Superintendent Wilson immediately grasped the strategic brilliance.
Community investment transforms narrative from school scandal to educational leadership and civil rights advancement. His administrative background recognized that proactive justice carried superior optics to reactive punishment, especially when federal investigators were evaluating institutional commitment versus administrative theater. Documentation is essential, Sarah added, her legal experience anticipating resistance from administrators who might oppose cultural change. Federal lawsuit capability, Department of Education investigation into systematic tracking bias, legislative testimony requirements, personal administrative liability under Civil Rights Act provisions. Her warnings weren't theoretical. Other educational institutions had faced identical consequences when discrimination became systematic rather than aberrational. Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years ago, she'd sat in a similar conference room as the victim of discrimination, watching administrators debate her academic worthiness like a budget line item. Her own mother, the legendary public servant who'd first taught her to recognize institutional bias despite personal pain, had taught her a crucial lesson. When you achieve power, use it to protect people who don't have any. That's how institutional change actually happens. Timeline needs aggressive implementation to demonstrate commitment while remaining realistic enough to ensure success, Zoe said, checking her watch. 30 days for administrative transitions, 60 days for comprehensive training launch, 90 days for equitable access system deployment. The schedule reflected lessons learned from other institutions that had survived discrimination scandals through decisive action rather than gradual reform. Governor Robinson's voice carried final authority as the executive decision-maker. Approved unanimously across all recommendations. Sarah, coordinate with federal investigators to demonstrate proactive compliance beyond legal minimums. James, prepare communication strategy emphasizing systematic reform over individual punishment. Zoe, maintain oversight authority through your Student Equity Committee with quarterly board reporting requirements. Her decisions reflected leadership understanding that discrimination scandals required institutional transformation rather than crisis management. The conference room atmosphere shifted as participants processed the magnitude of what had occurred. Routine educational discrimination had become catalysts for statewide reform, live-streamed to hundreds of thousands and documented with sufficient precision to create federal case studies. Zoe had transformed from victim to architect of systematic change, wielding familial position to ensure accountability that most discrimination targets never achieve. There's one final consideration, Zoe said quietly, her voice carrying personal weight rather than inherited authority. Today demonstrates why diversity in leadership matters practically, not symbolically. If I'd been any other black student without political connections, Diana and Robert's discrimination would have continued unchallenged indefinitely. Real institutional change requires people with power, using that power to protect people without it. The meeting concluded with handshakes that felt like signing administrative surrender documents. Diana Wilkins and Robert Caldwell's administrative careers were being redirected, while systematic discrimination faced institutional death sentence. Zoe gathered her mother's portfolio, the leather case that had carried her through countless political battles, now holding documents that would reshape state education's approach to equality. Walking from the conference room at 4:30 p.m., Zoe knew that today's discrimination had become tomorrow's justice, live-streamed globally and documented with sufficient precision to create federal case studies. Zoe had transformed from victim to architect of systematic change, wielding familial position to ensure accountability that most discrimination targets never achieve. There's one final consideration, Zoe said quietly, her voice carrying personal weight rather than inherited authority. Today demonstrates why diversity in leadership matters practically, not symbolically. If I'd been any other black student without political connections, Diana and Robert's discrimination would have continued unchallenged indefinitely. Real institutional change requires people with power, using that power to protect people without it. The meeting concluded with handshakes that felt like signing administrative surrender documents. Diana Wilkins and Robert Caldwell's administrative careers were being redirected, while systematic discrimination faced institutional death sentence. Zoe gathered her mother's portfolio, the leather case that had carried her through countless political battles, now holding documents that would reshape state education's approach to equality. Walking from the conference room at 4:30 p.m., Zoe knew that today's discrimination had become tomorrow's justice, live-streamed globally and documented with sufficient precision to create federal case studies. Zoe had transformed from victim to architect of systematic change, wielding familial position to ensure accountability that most discrimination targets never achieve. There's one final consideration, Zoe said quietly, her voice carrying personal weight rather than inherited authority. Today demonstrates why diversity in leadership matters practically, not symbolically. If I'd been any other black student without political connections, Diana and Robert's discrimination would have continued unchallenged indefinitely. Real institutional change requires people with power, using that power to protect people without it. Diana Wilkins' hands shook as she signed the reassignment papers at 8:30 a.m. the next morning, in the same conference room where she'd once celebrated becoming principal. Zoe wasn't present. She'd learned from her mother's political wisdom that victims witnessing their perpetrator's downfall felt hollow rather than satisfying. True justice came through systematic change, not individual revenge. Your administrative role is suspended pending completion of comprehensive bias training, announced Human Resources Director Patricia Kim with clinical precision.
The discrimination violated state civil rights laws and exposed Westridge Academy to regulatory sanctions. Diana's educational career wasn't ending, but transforming through mandatory retraining that would follow her into whatever future position she held. Every administrator would know her previous discrimination had required rehabilitation rather than simple discipline. Robert Caldwell faced identical consequences in an adjacent office. His 7-year climb through educational administration paused by 23 minutes of filmed bias. Zoe had specifically requested that both reassignments occur simultaneously, remembering how institutional discrimination required collective accountability rather than individual scapegoating. The security footage had been devastating. Robert's aggressive escalation had transformed workplace prejudice into potential civil rights violation. Officer Thompson received different treatment, mandatory retraining and probation rather than reassignment. His security training had included bias recognition protocols he'd initially followed correctly until administrative pressure overwhelmed his better judgment. Zoe had advocated for this measured response during the board meeting, remembering the teachers who'd chosen her support over punishment when she'd made early academic mistakes. Thompson would become living proof that second chances could produce institutional change agents. The public apology aired at noon across all district platforms, each word reviewed by civil rights investigators monitoring educational response in real time. Zoe had insisted on unconditional acknowledgement rather than defensive explanations. Her AP government research on institutional crisis management had shown that accepting responsibility accelerated recovery while deflection prolonged damage. Westridge Academy acknowledges that discrimination occurred and apologizes unconditionally, the statement began, words that carried weight because they admitted fault without qualification. But Zoe knew from personal experience that apologies meant nothing without systematic prevention. The equal access protocol she designed during sleepless nights following the incident launched 60 days later, transforming student services across every school in the district. The policy eliminated arbitrary questioning about student belonging. Staff could only restrict access based on documented enrollment criteria, never based on appearance or cultural assumptions. The monitoring technology represented Zoe's most ambitious reform, born from her mother's legislative wisdom. Fix problems at their source, sweetheart, not after they cause damage. Data-driven analysis detected bias in real time, scanning every student placement for discriminatory patterns, course access disparities, and documentation requirements that varied by student demographics. Monthly assessments identified staff showing prejudice patterns before they became Diana Wilkins-level problems. The system prevented 12 potential discrimination incidents in its first month, reported District Technology Officer Amanda Morgan during quarterly board review. Staff received immediate intervention rather than students filing complaints. Zoe smiled, remembering her own discrimination experience. How different her academic journey might have been if someone had intervened before bias became lawsuit-worthy behavior. The training overhaul consumed 40 hours per administrator, replacing theoretical diversity seminars with practical bias recognition Zoe had designed from her own painful experiences. She'd personally reviewed every module, creating scenarios that felt authentic rather than academic because they drew from real discrimination she'd witnessed during her mother's investigation of dozens of schools. Good intentions without practical skills produced Diana Wilkins disasters, she'd insisted during policy development.
Statewide impact exceeded Governor Robinson's projections within 6 months. 35 school districts adopted similar discrimination monitoring, choosing proactive compliance over reactive crisis management. Zoe's AP government teacher called to say the incident had become required case study, teaching future public servants how systematic bias could be eliminated through institutional leadership rather than individual punishment. The mentorship program represented Zoe's most personal reform, academic support for minority students funded through district budget restructuring. These kids need to see themselves in educational leadership before they can imagine academic achievement, she'd explained to the State Education Journal.
The program drew from her own experience as the only black student in many AP classes, understanding how representation prevented the assumptions that had created her discrimination crisis. Success measured itself through data that would have impressed her AP statistics teacher. Discrimination complaints dropped 70% within 6 months, while minority student advanced placement enrollment increased 65%. More meaningfully, similar improvements rippled across the state as other institutions faced public pressure to match Westridge Academy's transformed standards rather than risk viral discrimination incidents. Zoe reflected on the transformation during her student address at the Educational Equity Summit she'd helped establish. "We didn't just reassign 2 discriminatory administrators, we eliminated the institutional culture that made their discrimination possible. That's the difference between punishment and prevention, between individual accountability and systematic change." The reforms had transformed personal humiliation into educational evolution, proving that discrimination's most powerful enemy wasn't individual punishment, but institutional transformation guided by people with power who remembered powerlessness intimately. Her mother's words echoed, "Sometimes your worst day becomes someone else's best hope." Today had become exactly that. 3 months later, Zoe Robinson walked through the same Westridge Academy hallway where her humiliation had been live-streamed to 250,000 viewers. But the marble floors now reflected something extraordinary, an institution transformed by accountability. Marcus Jackson, the young teacher who had risked his position to film the discrimination, approached with the confidence of someone whose courage had helped rewrite educational history. "Miss Robinson," Marcus said, his voice carrying pride that reminded Zoe of her own academic breakthroughs. "0 discrimination incidents across all AP programs this month. The monitoring system caught 8 potential problems before they became Diana Wilkins situations." The transformation was working exactly as Zoe had designed, prevention through data rather than punishment through lawsuits. Officer Thompson had evolved from complicit security guard to the training program's most effective facilitator. His personal experience with bias escalation helping other staff recognize when individual prejudice became institutional discrimination. During his latest session, Thompson had told participants, "I learned what Miss Robinson already knew. Good people can enable bad systems when they stop thinking and start assuming." His honesty about failure had become the foundation for systematic success. The ripple effects had exceeded Zoe's AP statistics projections. The Educational Equity Summit she'd helped establish drew statewide attendance as school districts competed to demonstrate bias elimination rather than risk viral discrimination disasters. Neighboring states implemented similar monitoring systems, professional education associations adopted bias training protocols, and regulatory agencies began treating discrimination as systemic risk rather than individual misconduct. Standing in this hallway, Zoe reflected on her mother's wisdom about transforming pain into purpose. The 23 minutes of film discrimination that had initially mortified her had become the catalyst protecting thousands of minority students from similar experiences. Her worst academic moment had evolved into her greatest contribution to educational justice, proving that individual courage combined with institutional power could reshape entire systems. The letters that arrived weekly told the real story. Minority students receiving equitable treatment at schools nationwide. Young people who would never know their dignity had been protected by reforms sparked in this exact spot. These represented the kind of impact Zoe had hoped to create through her work with her mother's investigation. Real-life changes where systematic reform prevented individual suffering rather than simply documenting it after the fact. Her mentorship program had grown beyond Westridge Academy into a comprehensive pipeline, introducing minority students to advanced academic opportunities. Watching young faces light up during college preparation workshops reminded her why representation mattered practically.
When students could envision themselves in honors programs, institutional assumptions about who belonged began crumbling naturally. Educational narratives were being rewritten from discrimination stories into achievement possibilities. The transformation proved her mother's legislative wisdom correct. Fix problems at their source. Instead of accepting discrimination as inevitable, Zoe had helped eliminate the systems that made bias acceptable and safe for institutions. The hallway where she'd once been humiliated now stood as proof that individual experiences could become collective protection when courage met opportunity. As Zoe prepared for her Harvard interview later that day, she remembered her mother's advice. Your worst day can become someone else's best hope. Today's reforms ensured that future students would never experience the discrimination she'd endured. Their dignity protected by changes born from her willingness to transform personal pain into institutional healing. Diana Wilkins approached hesitantly from the administrative wing. The former principal had completed her comprehensive bias training and now served as Westridge Academy's first equity compliance officer, a position created specifically to transform discriminatory gatekeepers into institutional guardians. Ms. Robinson, Diana began, the formality reflecting their permanently altered relationship. The quarterly tracking report is ready for your review before submission to the state board. The document represented Diana's personal redemption journey. 6 months earlier, she'd been public education's villain, her discrimination broadcast to hundreds of thousands. Today, she monitored the very system designed to prevent behaviors she once embodied. Zoe took the tablet, scanning metrics that would have impressed her AP data science teacher. Advanced placement enrollment among minority students had increased 83%. Academic achievement gaps narrowed by 14% across all subject areas. Student satisfaction surveys showed 91% positive responses about institutional fairness compared to 43% before their reforms. The numbers validated what Zoe had argued during the emergency board meeting, that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, but academically devastating. The transformation has been remarkable, Diana acknowledged, her voice carrying the humility that comes only through genuine self-reflection. I've been an educational administrator for 17 years, but I never truly understood how my own biases were shaping student opportunities. Her admission wasn't performative damage control, but the painful honesty of someone confronting their role in systematic injustice. Zoe remembered her mother's words during a particularly difficult campaign speech. Real change happens when people with power acknowledge their responsibility rather than defending their privileges. Diana's evolution represented exactly that, the uncomfortable growth that occurs when institutional authority confronts personal accountability. The Mentorship Committee has identified 37 students for advanced academic intervention, Diana continued, her administrative skills now serving equity rather than exclusion. Their potential was previously overlooked due to subjective evaluation criteria that our new system flagged as potentially discriminatory.
The technical language masked profound human impact. 37 young lives redirected from limited expectations to expanded opportunities, futures transformed through institutional reform rather than individual heroics. Zoe had researched similar intervention programs during her work with the state investigation, how seemingly minor policy adjustments could dramatically alter educational trajectories when bias was removed from decision-making processes. Her mother's political philosophy made tangible through educational metrics. The board chairperson requested your presentation at next month's statewide superintendent conference, Diana added. They believe our equity protocols could serve as template for national education standards. The invitation represented institutional validation of what began as personal discrimination response. Zoe's reforms moving from local crisis management to potential federal policy. She remembered her mother's assessment of educational leadership during their kitchen table conversations. Systems don't change because they want to. They change because someone makes staying the same more painful than evolving.
The viral footage of Zoe's discrimination had created exactly that dynamic, making educational bias so publicly uncomfortable that institutions voluntarily embraced reform rather than risk similar exposure. Marcus Jackson approached with tablet displaying latest social media metrics. His classroom techniques had evolved alongside his advocacy skills, transforming from isolated teacher documenting discrimination to institutional change agent training colleagues. The equity training videos have exceeded 1 million views, he reported, with satisfaction that comes from witnessing systemic transformation. Educational departments in 7 states have requested implementation guidelines. What began as spontaneous documentation of Zoe's discrimination had evolved into comprehensive reform blueprint, spreading through professional networks faster than traditional policy channels. Zoe examined the analytics with the practiced assessment she'd developed during her mother's campaigns. The geographical distribution revealed pattern alignment with historical discrimination data, regions with documented educational disparities showing highest engagement with reform materials. Educational justice finding receptive audience precisely where it was needed most. The state superintendent wants to feature your story during National Education Conference, Marcus added, his tone reflecting genuine appreciation rather than performative enthusiasm. They believe personal testimony combined with statistical outcomes creates most compelling case for systematic change. Zoe had initially resisted becoming the public face of educational reform, preferring policy work to personal exposure. But her mother's political wisdom had gradually reshaped her thinking. Policy without personal connection remains abstract, Governor Robinson often explained during legislative battles. People need to see themselves in the problem before they'll commit to the solution. Zoe's discrimination footage had provided exactly that connection, transforming theoretical bias into visceral reality that education professionals couldn't dismiss as isolated incident. "One condition for my participation," Zoe replied with the diplomatic precision she'd learned watching her mother navigate coalition politics. "The presentation must include student testimonials beyond my experience. Institutional discrimination affects thousands of students without governors for mothers." Her insistence wasn't performative humility, but strategic advocacy. Real reform required acknowledging systemic nature of educational bias rather than celebrating individual responses to discrimination. Marcus nodded with immediate understanding, having witnessed countless students facing similar barriers without Zoe's institutional protection. "I've already compiled video statements from 23 students across the district. Their experiences create comprehensive picture of systematic discrimination that our reforms have begun addressing."
His initiative demonstrated why Zoe had specifically requested his appointment as Equity Committee chairperson. Marcus understood innately that educational justice required collective documentation rather than isolated examples. The committee he'd assembled represented exactly the diverse perspectives Zoe had advocated during the emergency board meeting. Students, parents, teachers, administrators collaborating on discrimination prevention rather than crisis management. "The federal education investigators completed their compliance review yesterday," Diana interjected, her expression reflecting professional relief rather than personal vindication. "Their preliminary report cites our reforms as model implementation of civil rights standards in educational settings." The validation represented remarkable institutional turnaround. 6 months earlier, Westridge Academy had faced potential federal sanctions for discrimination patterns. Today, its reforms were being recommended as national standards for educational equity. Zoe reflected on her mother's assessment of institutional transformation during their earliest discussions of educational reform. "Crisis creates opportunity when leadership focuses on systematic solutions rather than individual blame." The investigation that began with Zoe's discrimination had evolved precisely that way, transforming personal humiliation into institutional revolution that benefited thousands of students. Robert Caldwell approached from the counseling center, his professional demeanor transformed through comprehensive bias training. The former vice principal now directed student support services,
His administrative skills redirected from gatekeeping to opportunity expansion. "The college acceptance statistics just arrived," he reported, professional satisfaction evident as he displayed metrics that would have impressed Zoe's guidance counselor. "Our first graduating class under the equity protocols shows 72% increase in competitive university admissions among minority students." The numbers represented real lives transformed through institutional reform rather than individual intervention. Dozens of students whose academic trajectories had been permanently altered by systematic changes born from Zoe's discrimination response. Robert's evolution demonstrated what her mother had repeatedly argued during legislative sessions, that effective reform created allies from former opponents by providing pathways to redemption rather than mechanisms for punishment. "The admissions offices specifically cited our advanced placement equity initiatives," Robert continued, professional pride evident in his assessment. "They've requested detailed implementation guidelines for their own selection committees." The institutional ripple effect exceeded what Zoe had projected during their emergency board meeting. Educational reform spreading organically through professional networks rather than regulatory mandates. Zoe remembered her mother's strategic assessment during similar policy implementations. Voluntary adoption creates sustainable transformation, where mandated compliance produces temporary adjustment. Westridge Academy's reforms were following exactly that trajectory, inspiring imitation through demonstrated success rather than regulatory requirement. Superintendent Wilson emerged from the administrative conference room, his expression carrying the satisfaction of educational leader witnessing transformative success. "The state legislature just unanimously approved the Robinson Educational Equity Act," he announced, referencing the comprehensive legislation Zoe had helped draft during late-night policy sessions with her mother. "Full implementation funding secured for every district statewide." The political victory represented remarkable transformation of public discourse around educational discrimination. What began as viral outrage over Zoe's personal experience had evolved into legislative consensus about systematic reform necessity. Her mother's political strategy vindicated through policy achievement that would affect thousands of students. "The bill includes everything we advocated," Wilson continued, professional satisfaction evident as he displayed legislative summary. "Data-driven access protocols, comprehensive bias training, equity monitoring technology, student advocacy committees."
The components represented blueprint Zoe had sketched during their emergency board meeting transformed through legislative process into state educational policy. Zoe reflected on her mother's assessment of policy development during their earliest discussions of educational reform. Effective legislation emerges from lived experience rather than theoretical ideals. The Robinson Educational Equity Act embodied exactly that principle, systematic solutions born from documented discrimination rather than abstract principles. As Zoe prepared for her Harvard interview that afternoon, she considered how dramatically her academic journey had evolved through this experience. 6 months earlier, she'd been a passionate student concerned about educational justice. Today, she'd helped reshape state educational policy, establishing reform frameworks that would protect thousands of students from discrimination she'd personally endured. Her application essay had evolved alongside her advocacy work, no longer theoretical assessment of educational inequality, but practical documentation of institutional transformation she'd personally facilitated. Harvard's admissions committee had specifically requested her participation in upcoming educational leadership symposium, recognizing that her experience transcended typical student advocacy. Officer Thompson approached with security metrics that revealed how completely Westridge Academy's culture had transformed. 0 reported discrimination incidents this quarter, he noted with professional satisfaction. The proactive intervention protocols identified and addressed 14 potential situations before they affected students. The statistics validated what Zoe had argued during the emergency board meeting, that effective reform required prevention systems rather than punishment mechanisms. Thompson's evolution represented particularly meaningful transformation. 6 months earlier, he'd been a reluctant participant in discriminatory practices, following administrative directions despite professional reservations. Today, he directed security protocols specifically designed to protect student dignity rather than institutional authority. His journey demonstrating how comprehensive reform created allies from former enablers.
As the hallway filled with students transitioning between classes, Zoe noticed a remarkable cultural transformation, demographic integration that would have impressed her sociology teacher. Advanced placement wing reflecting district's actual diversity rather than historical segregation patterns. Student interactions demonstrating comfortable familiarity rather than territorial separation. The systemic changes hadn't merely reformed administrative procedures, but transformed educational culture. What began as response to Zoe's discrimination had evolved into comprehensive reimagining of what equitable education could accomplish when institutions committed to genuine transformation rather than symbolic diversity. Marcus approached with particularly meaningful update. The student who recorded that incident at Lakeside Academy last month, he began, referencing discrimination situation at neighboring district. She specifically cited your experience as inspiration for documenting rather than accepting bias. The ripple effect represented exactly what Zoe had hoped might emerge from her public advocacy. Other students recognizing discrimination as systematic problem requiring institutional accountability, rather than personal burden requiring individual resilience. Her experience becoming template for collective response rather than isolated incident. As Zoe gathered her materials for the Harvard interview, she reflected on how completely her educational journey had been transformed through this experience. 6 months earlier, she'd been focused primarily on personal academic achievement. Today, she'd helped establish equity frameworks that would protect thousands of students from discrimination she'd personally endured. Her mother's words echoed as she prepared to leave Westridge Academy. Real leadership emerges when personal pain becomes collective purpose. Zoe had transformed her discrimination experience exactly that way, channeling individual humiliation into institutional transformation that benefited countless students without her privileged protection.
The hallway where she'd once faced educational gatekeeping now symbolized opportunity pathway for diverse students previously excluded from advanced academic resources. As she prepared to depart for her interview, Zoe noticed particularly meaningful transformation. Diana Wilkins and Robert Caldwell now conducted joint equity training for administrators from neighboring districts, their personal redemption journeys becoming professional development resources. Former discriminators transformed into institutional change agents through comprehensive reform rather than career destruction. The evolution represented exactly what her mother had advocated during similar professional crises. Effective accountability creates transformation rather than termination. Westridge Academy embodying that principle through administrative evolution rather than punitive replacement. The systematic changes hadn't merely reformed individual behaviors, but transformed institutional culture. Superintendent Wilson approached with notification that would have impressed Zoe's government teacher. The Department of Education has officially designated Westridge Academy as National Model School for Educational Equity, he reported with professional satisfaction. Site visits begin next month for administrators implementing similar reforms nationwide. The designation represented remarkable institutional transformation. 6 months earlier, Westridge had faced potential federal sanctions for discrimination patterns. Today, its reforms were being studied as implementation templates for national standards. Wilson's leadership demonstrating how crisis response could create institutional opportunity when focused on systematic solutions rather than damage control. As Zoe departed for her Harvard interview, she carried profound understanding that would shape her educational leadership journey. Discrimination wasn't inevitable institutional reality, but addressable systematic failure when accountability mechanisms created consequence for bias rather than protection for prejudice. Her experience transformed from personal humiliation into professional mission that would guide her educational advocacy for years to come. 6 months after the hallway incident that transformed Westridge Academy, Zoe Robinson stood at the podium of the National Educational Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C. The journey from discriminated student to educational reform advocate had been extraordinary, but watching hundreds of administrators lean forward as she shared her experience made every difficult moment worthwhile. Transformation begins when we acknowledge that educational discrimination isn't accidental, but systematic.
Zoe explained, her voice carrying the confidence she'd developed through months of advocacy. What happened in that hallway wasn't an isolated incident, but the visible symptom of invisible structures designed to determine who belongs and who doesn't. The audience included superintendents, principals, and education policymakers from every state, professionals with power to implement reforms Zoe's experience had inspired. Her mother, Governor Elise Robinson, watched from the front row, pride evident as her daughter translated personal humiliation into institutional guidance that would protect countless students nationwide. The metrics don't just represent educational outcomes, Zoe continued, displaying statistics that showcased Westridge Academy's transformation. They represent human potential previously buried under institutional assumptions about who deserves advanced opportunities based on how they look rather than how they learn. The presentation included testimonials Zoe had insisted upon, students without political connections sharing discrimination experiences that mirrored her own, their voices creating comprehensive narrative about educational gatekeeping that transcended any single incident. Marcus Jackson had compiled these stories into powerful documentation that transformed theoretical bias into undeniable reality. What makes our reform model unique isn't punishment, but prevention, Zoe explained, transitioning to implementation guidance administrators had specifically requested. We didn't just remove discriminatory individuals, we eliminated the systems that made their discrimination possible and profitable.
The distinction represented crucial evolution in educational equity approach, moving beyond symbolic diversity toward structural transformation that eliminated gatekeeping mechanisms rather than simply replacing gatekeepers. Zoe's mother had championed this approach throughout her political career, arguing that sustainable change required systematic redesign rather than individual replacement. U.S. Secretary of Education Catherine Williams approached the podium after Zoe's presentation, her expression reflecting professional recognition of transformative approach. The Robinson model, as we're calling it nationally, represents paradigm shift in educational equity implementation, she announced to assembled leaders. These reforms will be incorporated into federal compliance guidelines effective next semester. The announcement represented institutional validation beyond what even Governor Robinson had anticipated. Educational discrimination response developed through Zoe's experience, becoming national standard rather than local initiative. As Q&A session began, Superintendent from Mississippi raised hand with practical implementation question that demonstrated how completely the conversation had evolved. The discussion wasn't whether discrimination existed or mattered, but how best to implement proven solutions across diverse educational environments. Our technical infrastructure is limited, he explained. How can we adapt your monitoring systems for rural districts with minimal technology resources? The question represented exactly the implementation focus Zoe had hoped might emerge from her presentation, moving beyond theoretical agreement toward practical application across diverse educational contexts. Zoe's response demonstrated the policy expertise she'd developed through months working alongside her mother's educational task force. We've developed tiered implementation protocols specifically designed for resource-constrained environments, she explained, displaying adaptation guidelines her team had created, anticipating exactly this concern. The core principles function independently of technology sophistication. Equal access criteria, standardized documentation requirements, and comprehensive bias training can be implemented without advanced monitoring systems. Her response reflected sophisticated understanding of implementation challenges that impressed veteran administrators and attendants. During conference reception following her presentation, Zoe found herself surrounded by educational leaders seeking implementation guidance for their districts. The conversations reflecting remarkable transformation in how discrimination was understood and addressed in educational context. No longer debating whether bias existed, but collaborating on best practices for systematic prevention.
Harvard's dean of admissions approached with news that would have delighted Zoe's guidance counselor. "Your application has been accepted with full scholarship," she announced, professional admiration evident in her assessment. "The educational leadership you've demonstrated through this reform initiative represents exactly the transformative impact Harvard seeks to cultivate." The acceptance represented validation beyond academic achievement. Recognition that Zoe's response to discrimination demonstrated exceptional leadership capacity that transcended typical student advocacy. Her mother had suggested similar trajectory during their earliest discussions of educational reform, noting that institutional transformation often created unexpected opportunities for those courageous enough to demand accountability. The recognition validated Governor Robinson's insistence that effective policy emerged from lived experience rather than theoretical frameworks. During flight home, Zoe reflected on an extraordinary journey that began with humiliating discrimination and culminated in national reform initiative bearing her family name. Her mother's political wisdom proven correct through institutional transformation that exceeded their most optimistic projections. Educational justice finding receptive audience precisely where it was needed most. As their private jet approached the Capitol, Governor Robinson shared assessment that captured the essence of their shared accomplishment. "What makes me proudest isn't just that you survived discrimination," she explained, parental pride evident in her expression. "It's how you transformed personal pain into institutional healing that will protect thousands of students who don't have governors from others." The distinction represented crucial understanding Zoe had developed throughout this experience. Individual resilience against discrimination was necessary but insufficient when bias remained institutionally profitable. Real transformation required systematic redesign that eliminated structural incentives for exclusionary practices rather than simply punishing individual discriminators. Returning to Westridge Academy the following Monday, Zoe found Diana Wilkins preparing implementation packets for administrators attending upcoming training session. The former principal's evolution from discriminatory gatekeeper to equity advocate, representing powerful testimony about redemption possibilities when reform focused on transformation rather than punishment. 7 more districts are sending administrative teams next week, Diana reported, professional satisfaction evident in her assessment. "The Robinson model implementation requests have exceeded our training capacity." The demand reflected how completely educational priorities had shifted following national conference, discrimination prevention becoming professional requirement rather than optional initiative. Diana's personal transformation represented particularly meaningful outcome for Zoe. 6 months earlier, she'd been institutional villain whose discrimination triggered state investigation. Today, she trained administrators implementing reforms specifically designed to prevent behaviors she once embodied. Her journey demonstrating how effective accountability created allies from former adversaries when focused on systemic improvement rather than individual destruction. "The bias recognition protocols have been particularly effective," Diana noted, displaying metrics that documented intervention success. "We are identifying problematic patterns before they manifest as discriminatory incidents." The prevention statistics validated what Zoe had advocated during emergency board meeting, that effective reform required proactive systems rather than reactive punishment. Robert Caldwell approached with college acceptance statistics that revealed how completely educational opportunities had transformed through their reforms. Minority student admissions to competitive universities increased 87% compared to previous year, he reported, professional pride evident in his assessment. Scholarship offers increased 124% across demographic categories. The numbers represented tangible outcomes beyond institutional compliance, real lives transformed through reforms born from Zoe's discrimination response. Students who might previously have been tracked away from advanced opportunities now receiving recognition their talents deserved. Educational meritocracy becoming reality rather than rhetorical aspiration. Marcus Jackson arrived with media metrics that demonstrated how completely their reforms had transformed national conversation around educational equity.
The Robinson model implementation videos have exceeded 5 million views, he reported. Educational departments in 17 countries have requested adaptation guidelines. The global impact exceeded what even Governor Robinson had projected during their earliest discussions of reform potential.
What began as spontaneous documentation of Zoe's discrimination had evolved into international template for educational transformation, spreading through professional networks faster than traditional policy channels. The viral nature of both problem and solution creating implementation momentum that bureaucratic processes alone could never have generated. Superintendent Wilson approached with legislative update that would have impressed Zoe's government teacher. 6 neighboring states have introduced Robinson Educational Equity Acts modeled on our legislation, he reported. Bipartisan support across regional political divisions. The political consensus represented remarkable transformation in how educational discrimination was understood and addressed across ideological spectrums. No longer partisan debate about whether bias existed, but practical collaboration on implementing proven solutions with documented effectiveness. Zoe's mother had predicted exactly this trajectory during their earliest discussions of reform strategy, noting that demonstrable success often transcended political divisions when framed around educational opportunity rather than ideological positioning. As senior year progressed, Zoe found herself increasingly involved in national implementation efforts while maintaining oversight of Westridge Academy's ongoing transformation. Her dual perspective as both discrimination victim and reform architect, providing unique insight essential for effective policy development. Her mother had suggested similar trajectory during their earliest discussions of educational advocacy, noting that personal experience, combined with policy expertise, created particularly powerful platform for institutional change. Harvard deferred Zoe's enrollment to accommodate her Department of Education fellowship, unprecedented recognition of high school students' essential contribution to national policy development. The accommodation reflecting institutional acknowledgement that her experience and response offered unique perspective that transcended traditional academic qualifications. During spring graduation ceremony, Zoe reflected on extraordinary journey that began with hallway humiliation and culminated in educational transformation affecting millions of students nationwide. Her valedictorian speech captured the essence of lessons learned through this experience. True change happens when we transform discrimination from individual burden to institutional responsibility, she explained to assembled graduates and families. What happened in that hallway wasn't just about me, but about invisible systems that determine educational destinies based on how students look rather than how they learn. The distinction represented crucial understanding she'd developed throughout this journey, that effective reform required addressing structural causes rather than symptomatic behaviors. As Zoe prepared to transition from student advocate to Department of Education fellow, she received particularly meaningful recognition from unexpected source. Officer Thompson, whose security intervention had escalated her discrimination incident, approached with metrics that documented complete transformation in how student belonging was assessed and protected at Westridge Academy. 0 discrimination incidents for entire academic year, he reported, with professional satisfaction that transcended compliance requirements. The protocols you designed have eliminated the conditions that made bias possible and profitable. His assessment validated what Zoe had argued during the emergency board meeting, that effective reform required prevention systems rather than punishment mechanisms. During private conversation before Zoe's departure for Washington Fellowship, her mother shared assessment that captured essence of their shared accomplishment. What we've achieved isn't just policy implementation, but cultural transformation, Governor Robinson explained. We've changed how educational justice is understood and addressed nationwide. The distinction represented crucial evolution in discrimination response, moving beyond individual accountability toward systemic redesign that eliminated structural incentives for exclusionary practices. Zoe's personal experience transformed into an institutional blueprint that protected students who would never know their educational opportunities had been secured through her willingness to demand accountability rather than accepting injustice. As Department of Education fellowship began, Zoe found herself at implementation table with educational leaders 3 times her age, her perspective valued precisely because she embodied both problem and solution they sought to address nationally. Her unique combination of personal experience and policy expertise providing essential foundation for guidelines that would affect millions of students across diverse educational environments. During orientation session, Federal Compliance Director Reynolds shared assessment that captured unique value Zoe brought to implementation process. What makes the Robinson model particularly effective isn't just its technical design, but its human foundation, he explained to assembled task force. These reforms emerged from lived experience rather than theoretical frameworks, which gives them practical functionality across diverse educational contexts. The distinction represented exactly what Zoe's mother had advocated throughout her political career, that effective policy emerged from authentic understanding rather than abstract principles. The Robinson Educational Equity Act embodying that philosophy through mechanisms specifically designed to address discrimination as experienced rather than as theorized. As implementation guidelines took final form, Zoe reflected on an extraordinary journey that had transformed her from discrimination victim to educational reform architect. The path hadn't been easy, but watching her personal humiliation evolve into institutional healing that would protect countless students made every difficult moment worthwhile. Her mother's wisdom proven correct through outcomes that exceeded their most optimistic projections. Returning to Westridge Academy for special ceremony marking first anniversary of reforms that now bore her family name, Zoe found institution transformed beyond recognition. Advanced placement demographics reflecting district's actual diversity rather than historical segregation patterns. Faculty composition showcasing representation across cultural backgrounds. Student interactions demonstrating integrated community rather than territorial separation. The systemic changes hadn't merely reformed administrative procedures, but transformed educational culture. What began as response to Zoe's discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of what equitable education could accomplish when institutions committed to genuine transformation rather than symbolic diversity. Principal Torres, who replaced Diana after her transition to equity coordinator, shared assessment that captured essence of institutional transformation. What makes these reforms sustainable isn't just their technical design, but their cultural foundation, he explained during anniversary ceremony. We haven't just changed procedures, but underlying assumptions about who belongs and who deserves advanced opportunities. The distinction represented crucial evolution in discrimination response, addressing root causes rather than symptomatic behaviors. Zoe's mother had championed this approach throughout her political career, arguing that sustainable change required fundamental reassessment of institutional assumptions rather than cosmetic adjustments to existing structures. As ceremony concluded, Zoe reconnected with Marcus Jackson, whose spontaneous documentation had transformed routine discrimination into national reform catalyst. Their conversation capturing remarkable journey from isolated incident to institutional revolution. When I started recording that day, I never imagined we'd be changing national education policy, Marcus acknowledged, professional satisfaction evident in his assessment. I just knew something wrong was happening and needed to be witnessed. His instinctive response demonstrating how individual courage created foundation for collective accountability when institutional justice required documented evidence rather than subjective testimony. Zoe's final address before returning to Washington captured lessons learned through extraordinary journey that began with hallway humiliation and culminated in educational transformation affecting millions of students nationwide. What happened in that hallway wasn't unique, she explained to assembled administrators and students.
Educational justice becoming systematic reality rather than occasional victory when institutions committed to transformation rather than symbolic accountability. As Implementation Task Force prepared national guidelines for final release, Federal Compliance Director Reynolds shared assessment that captured essence of their collective achievement. The Robinson model represents paradigm shift in educational equity approach, he explained during final review session. We're moving beyond diversity rhetoric towards structural transformation that eliminates conditions making discrimination possible and profitable.
The distinction represented exactly what Zoe had advocated since her earliest involvement in reform development, focusing on prevention systems rather than punishment mechanisms. Her mother's political philosophy made tangible through educational metrics that documented transformation beyond what regulatory compliance alone could have achieved. Throughout her fellowship experience, Zoe remained connected to Westridge Academy's ongoing implementation, receiving weekly updates that documented continued evolution of reforms bearing her family name. The sustained impact validating what her mother had predicted during their earliest discussions of her discrimination response, that personal resilience created foundation for collective protection when individual experience became catalyst for institutional transformation rather than isolated survival story. Educational justice becoming systematic reality rather than occasional victory when discrimination faced structural accountability rather than symbolic consequences. As Zoe prepared for delayed Harvard enrollment following her fellowship completion, she reflected on an extraordinary journey that began with hallway humiliation and culminated in educational transformation affecting students nationwide. The path hadn't been easy, but watching her personal discrimination evolve into reform blueprint made every difficult moment meaningful beyond what she could have imagined when Diana Wilkins first challenged her belonging. Sometimes, her mother had observed during particularly challenging implementation phase, the worst moments become foundations for the most important changes when we refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Zoe's experience had proven that wisdom correct beyond what either of them had projected when they first discussed educational discrimination during kitchen table conversations that eventually reshaped national policy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.